Hello there everybody, welcome back to OriginalTechNic, Nicola Kench Design. I be Nicola Kench, and this is welcome really to the whole next phase, the next tier that I've been planning for some time regarding my enterprises and design work. First of all, what I do is I obviously do the ready-made stuff, the t-shirts, the handbags, the hats, all of that stuff, which I call genuine antiques. Then the middle tier is what I like to call Find Your Inner Leonardo. And this is really where I teach people how to design and pass on these skills that I have. Right? I believe deeply, and I've called this department of the business, Find Your Inner Leonardo, scratch, scratch, hello Leonardo, find your inner Leonardo, because I believe that inside every single human being there is an essence of a creative and an artistic drive. It's simply a case of tapping into that. And I love the medium of knitting because it's so accessible and people can begin to experiment and find out the things that they've always wanted to make, the garments that they've always wanted to make. Just to say, yes, that I like to teach knitting, and not just teach knitting, but to teach design at the same time. I've been designing knitwear for forever, all right? I am an autodidact, I'm a little freak. I didn't go anywhere near St. Martin's or anything like that. I'm somebody who's been doing this all my life. And I have taught design before to people, explaining and teaching really how to knit and how to design at the same time. And it is a thing of joy to see people suddenly go, that all makes sense. I can understand how to build something, how to construct something. I can now make the garment that I always wanted to make, the jumper, the hat, the scarf. I met a woman who made a dress. Amazing, all right? So, yes, what I want to talk to you today is this first series of videos will Find Your Inner Leonardo, the joy of knitting. Yes, is I want to talk to you about some of the key principles for when you start knitting, all right? The name of this video is obviously needle size and yarn type, and I'm going to be going through some of the key basic needle sizes and yarn types with suggestions as to how to get started. This first series of videos is 7 videos. There's the needle size and yarn type. Then we're going to talk about, there's going to be another one which is casting on, casting off, knitting, purl, and sewing in threads, as well as a final video with a project to get you started, an easy, simple, satisfying project to get you started. So these videos are in order. Right, first things first, what I want to say is that this chart, I'm going to actually put this onto the screen, right? This chart that you see on the screen right now in front of you shows 4 of the main types of knitwear, all right, from where you can start. 4 of the main types of needle size and yarn type as a starter knitter. It also shows a 50p piece, and it shows the size needles of 4mm, 5mm, 6mm, and 10mm. With the matching yarn type. 4mm is double knitting yarn, 5mm is Aran yarn, 6mm is chunky yarn, and 10mm is super chunky yarn. I'm going to go through that and explain that to you properly in detail right now, and explain to you why and with what you really should start as a starter knitter. Okay. So just to let you know, needle sizes come in a vast array of sizes. They literally can start at 2.5mm. Just to quickly say about needle sizes, they are run on metric sizing these days, okay? When we talk about the needle size, we do not talk about the perimeter around the needle. We talk about the diameter. The width of the needle is the needle size, just to make sense of it, because otherwise it's just a number without meaning. Right. So we can get needle sizes that literally start at 2.5mm diameter. That's tiny, right the way up to 25mm, which is like that big. Okay, I have knitted on 25mm needles. It's simply a cavort. I make bigger things, which is also part of what I do design-wise, which I'm going to be exhibiting sometime this decade. I make giant sculptural pieces, etc., etc., etc. Anyhow, right. And of course, we have arm knitting, which people are, quite familiar with these days, to make giant pieces of, blankets or furniture, etc., etc. And of course, at that point, the arm is in fact the knitting needle, and you have the giant yarn that you knit. Right, so we get an idea from very small to literally the arm following 25 millimeters as we go through. Right, what I want to start off with here is I want to start off with a type of yarn that you would have generally, if you've gone anywhere near the world of knitting, the dark and intrepid world of knitting, you might have encountered double knitting. Okay, I will be panning and giving detailed shots of these later on. But this here is a ball of double knitting wool. Now, when you use double knitting, you generally use a size 4 millimeter needle. What we have here is we have the chart for double knitting, the sheet for double knitting, which is part of the chart that is the free PDF download on my site. Right, on www.originaltechnic.com. So what we have here is we have double knitting yarn, 4 millimeter needles. The sample that I have here, you hold that up, all right, is 30 stitches with 30 rows, and that gives you a width of 13.5 centimeters and a height of 7.5 centimeters. On the chart, that is the free download on OriginalTechNic.com, the free PDF download, you will see the actual sizing of this little piece of knitting, which is your sample to demonstrate sizes. So there you go. That's a 4 millimeter needle with double knitting. This is a 4 millimeter double knitted self-designed garment. It's actually got bees and leaves all over it, and this is quite fine. It's quite fine. Right, pan back up here to show you the size of the stitch roughly of a 4 millimeter knitted garment. There you go. There's the needle size, 4 millimeters. Right, and there's just an example of the sizing there. Going down to the sample. Hey everybody, what I want to do now is I actually want to show you what it's like to knit with double knitting, to actually see that in the hand, right, and to see the size of it. Right, so this is double knitting. We've gone through the ball. The needle size is size 4 millimeter, and I'm just going to quickly show you that. Right. Okay. Forgive me for knitting quickly. That is many years spent as a machine. Right. Much smaller there, 4 millimeter. And of course, we know from the sizing that that's going to take some time to get anywhere. Right, this sample is 30 stitches, 30 rows, and it's 13.5 centimeters times 7.5 centimeters height. Okay, there you go. That's double knitting on 4 millimeter needles. Generally, the next size up is an Aran yarn, which is similar to double knitting, but slightly thicker. So then, when we're using the Aran yarn, which is slightly thicker than before, we use a 5 millimeter needle. Okay, so here, this is the sample for Aran wool. All right, it's a 5 millimeter needle, and again, I've done the same thing to show the difference in the sizes when you knit with different wool, with different needle sizes. This is the sample. All right, this is on the chart that is the free PDF download. It is 15.5 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters high. Slightly bigger needles, slightly thicker wool, and what we see here, all right, is the Aran is slightly bigger than the double knitting sample. Okay, this one here, again, also self-designed, is Aran. It's slightly chunkier, right? It's slightly chunkier. 4 millimeter for double knit, 5 millimeter for Aran. Exemplar is the Aran wool with the 5 millimeter needle size. Panning down here to the sample, 30 stitches, 30 rows, next to the 50p piece. Right, and I'm just going to quickly show you the stitch size there is slightly larger than the double knitting and the 4 millimeter needle. Again, not a recommendation for a starter knitter. It will take you ages. Right, everybody, Just get that there. Now I want to show you literally as it gets knitted, the next size up, which is the 5mm needles and the Aran yarn. A bit bigger, but certainly nowhere near super chunky speed yet. Okay. Right, I'm going to hold up this sheet. There you go. Aran size 5mm needles. Oopsie, size 5mm needles. Right, and what this does, it creates this sample, which is 15.5 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters high. Not great for a starter knitter either. Right, the next step up is, of course, the type of wool that a lot of starter knitters would have used, which is chunky wool. All right, so what we have here, with chunky wool, you use 6mm needles. The diameter is 6mm. It's thicker. Here is the sample. Let me take the sheet for that. Here is the sample and there is the sheet. And as I said before, all of this information is on the free PDF download at OriginalTechNic.com. Right, so for this, again, to show the difference in the sizes, I've used 30 stitches and 30 rows to show you that even when you're knitting with the same amount of stitches and the same amount of rows, simply a chunky needle and a chunky wool will get you a vastly different size. Yeah, there we go. Excuse me, that's falling off there. There we go. Right. Okay, that is the tiny one and this is the much bigger one. Same amount of stitches, same amount of rows. This one here is a chunky knit 6mm, not my own design. This long cardigan, there you go. Now this is the exemplar for chunky wool. Things are getting a bit thicker. Right, with a 6mm needle. Let me just quickly pan down. There is the sample size next to a 50p piece. And get a rough sense of that. And here you can see the stitch size on a chunky knitted garment. Chunky is a lot better for a starter knitter, but it's not the ultimate recommendation, which is what we're coming to now. 6mm needle and chunky wool. Now a lot of starter knitters would have actually used chunky wool before. It's really not a bad place to start. As we know, I've been waxing lyrical about the next step up, which is actually super chunky. Right, there you go, and that is the type of jumper size stitch as we've seen before. There you go. Creates a sample for 30 stitches and 30 rows, much wider, 22 centimeters wide. There we go, and 12.5 centimeters high. So we're getting there in terms of satisfaction and work ratio. Right, and now we go up a step. All right, and what I'm going to show you now is super chunky yarn. Right, super chunky yarn. Here is the sample. The needles that you use for super chunky yarn are in fact actually a centimeter wide, that is 10mm wide. Right, so what this is again is 30 stitches and 30 rows. Here is the sheet for it, and again that is part of your chart that you will have on the download to show you exactly the difference in the sizes that you will get between a size 4mm needle knitting and a size 10mm needle knitting with super chunky wool. So here we go. Both of these are 30 stitches and 30 rows. The one is really 8 times roughly the size of the other. On super chunky wool, super chunky wool, it's actually a kind of a patterned jumper, super chunky wool, size 10mm needles, a very, very, very quick knit, which created this whole jumper. What we have here is a super chunky, super thick yarn. You can see the size of those stitches there in the super chunky yarn knitted jumper, with a 10mm needle, which is actually a full centimetre. There's the relative size next to a 50p piece, and there is the sample, which is like all the others, 30 stitches for 30 rows. Right, much, much, much bigger than the 4mm needle sample. And here we are finally at super chunky yarn with 10mm needles. I just want you to see what that's like to actually knit. Much, much, much bigger compared to the original sample. For example, that is Aran. Yeah. So we knit this, right, far more, far quicker, far more instant gratification, particularly for a starter knitter where you want to see where you're going quickly and you want to know that you're not going to be suffering forever. There you go, much, much bigger there. The size there for 30 stitches, 30 rows is, the width is 32 centimeters and the height is 18 centimeters. Right, there you go, a great place to start. I want to show you the samples, 4mm and 5mm. Remember that every single one of these samples is 30 stitches and 30 rows. There you go, 4mm, 5mm. That is double knit and Aran, 6mm, much bigger there. That is the chunky wool. And then here, even bigger, is the size 10mm super chunky wool. Right, again, 30 stitches and 30 rows. Much, much, much better to start with the super chunky wool size 10mm needles if you are a beginner knitter. Less suffering, please. And lastly, because again, I'm clearly very keen to stress this because I've seen so many sad starter knitters on the tiny needles. That's 4mm, 5mm, 6mm, and 10mm. And they're all 30 stitches and 30 rows. So clearly, super chunky is your place to start. I have witnessed many a beloved starter knitter start to knit on double knitting and really go basically quite bonkers, which is unfortunate and unnecessary. My recommendation, and I'll be going into more detail in the 7th of this series of videos, is that you use super chunky yarn and size 10mm needles so that your 30 stitches and your 30 rows gets you this much knitting as opposed to this much knitting. And of course, what we have then is we have greater fun, greater satisfaction, less time, more result, and you start to get the idea of how you can actually do things instead of sitting there and suffering with the thin wool and the thin needles. You don't need that in your life, I promise you. I have held up these different sheets, okay, which show you the difference between double knit, 4mm, Aran, 5mm, chunky, 6mm, and super chunky 10mm. And as I said, this is all available on the free PDF download, which is on OriginalTechNic.com. Now I've got the 4 samples lined up. I've showed you in all different ways, all different formats, sample garments, the sample squares, the sheets that demonstrate with the free online download PDF of all the different needle sizes and the type of size that they will actually knit. In this first series of videos for The Joy of Knitting, Find Your Inner Leonardo, OriginalTechNic, Nicola Kench Design, I be Nicola Kench, there will be a series of videos that build up to explaining what was a great first project for a starter knitter. So the forthcoming videos in this series are going to be casting on, knitting, purling, casting off and sewing in threads, and the final video will introduce you to the specifics of a starter project, which is a great way to start and a great way to ease our way the forthcoming months into winter. Thank you so much for watching. I will be running workshops in person further down this year. I look forward to meeting you. I look forward to teaching you more. This really is the absolute basics of how to get started. I have a design teaching system that teaches people step by step from beginner, intermediate to advanced of how to design your own garments. But there's always a place to start, which is the thrill. All right, I've been doing this for years. I find it a form of meditation, as I have explained. It can be incredibly satisfying to have something in your mind and to make that, and that is really a primary form of creativity that I think is wonderful, to create a format, a medium for people to experiment with, and that is the great advantage of the accessibility of knitting. As you see down there, there should be some sort of button that says subscribe. Press subscribe to the channel. There'll be forthcoming videos coming up explaining everything step by step. Press the little button that gives you the notifications. And I shall see you soon as we grow together and as we knit together. I say welcome again to the Joy of Knitting, part of Find Your Inner Leonardo, Original Technic, Nicola Kench Design. I be Nicola Kench, and I will see you soon. Take care.